Public-private partnerships are complex transactions. Their contracts run between 400 to 600 pages. Many people worldwide try to have a unified contract for public-private partnerships. This didn't work. So what most countries try to do is to identify the clauses that are problematic in public-private partnership. This is why we prepared this presentation, to highlight some of these clauses that are heavily negotiated in all public-private partnerships. These clauses, namely, are force majeure, material adverse government change, change in law by the government, of course, termination benefits, that's when the government decides to terminate a contract, refinancing, that's when the global financial markets become more inducive and the interest rate falls, so both parties will try to pay back the debt and get new debt to have lesser financing charges and payment preferred payment terms. Lender step in right, this is when all goes wrong. When the guy who's supposed to do the project fails and the banks, they start chasing after him, the contract gives the lender step in right to come in and manage the project, including kicking out the developer or the party doing the project. Confidentiality and transparency, this is more important for the government than the developers, because the public, many times they will request more information about the project. So it is the government sometimes who tries to restrict confidentiality rather than the private developer. And dispute resolution, public-private partnerships are prone to disputes. 50% of public-private contracts are renegotiated during the first year or so. Big portions of those contracts, they go to dispute resolving mechanisms. We will quickly go over these clauses in the presentation to highlight some of the issues that need to be watched for. Standardizing, it's not possible, we said. Force majeure. Force majeure is something that nobody controls. So naturally, you would want to assume that both parties have to bear share if a force majeure happens. Usually, public-private partnerships contains exhaustive lists of force majeure items. This needs to be restricted. This is where the negotiation comes in. Which item constitute a force majeure, which does not. If a force majeure happens, both parties share the risk, both parties share the extra cost. This is why it's important to limit these items. Material adverse government change, this when the government changes the law, for example, and the developer gets affected adversely. Does he have the right to exit? Sometimes he does. If this continues for an extended period of time, like between 6 to 12 months, then he is entitled for compensation. For example, the government decided to raise fuel fees. This project is a major consumption of fuel, so he's entitled to be compensated because the law had changed. Basically, change in law, it's very similar to material adverse government change. Material adverse government change is something that directly hits the project. Change in law is something that overarching, it hits the entire country. Both are similar. So if the change is narrow, we call it material adverse government change. If the change is statutory, we call it change in law. But both, they have the same effect and the same treatment. Termination benefits. This is a very difficult subject to discuss because the basic notion here, if the government terminates the contract, then the developer is entitled to the same benefits as if the contract had not been terminated. This means what? This means if you terminated in year 5 and the contract is for 15 years, is he entitled to the profits for the remaining years? The answer is yes. So this is a heavily negotiating clause. The government tries to limit the benefits in case of termination. Refinancing, as we discussed, when you can get better financing today than what you got like 5 years ago. It applies to almost everything, like personal loans. Sometimes you decide to close your personal loan, get a new loan from the same bank with a lesser interest rate. The same happens in public-private partnerships. Because we're talking about huge amounts of money here, like 200, 300 million, it makes a difference. Even a small dip in financing charges will result in huge reduction in payments. So this is something both parties try to have in their contract, and it works to both parties' interests. It's not like one party will gain, the other will lose. It is in the interest of both parties to do refinancing if circumstances change. Lenders step in right. This is public-private partnership are 90% or sometimes a little bit less, like 80% are financed by banks. The person doing the project, he puts 10 to 20% money out of his pocket. So the major lenders, they have a keen interest in making sure this project proceeds smoothly. If the project starts having difficulty, who will start screaming? The banks, because they're giving 80 to 90% of their money for this project. So what they do, they try to have so many provisions in the contract to control if the project goes south. For example, the ultimate right they have in these contracts is to kick out the developer. Before kicking out the developer, they have certain procedures. They are progressive, what we call. You start with requesting information. Lenders, banks, we need information. Then standstill period. The banks ask the government, hold your horses. We need to talk to this guy. And then if that fails, then they will bring additional partner to the project to assess the existing one and make the new partner liable. If all fails, then they kick out the existing one and appoint one of their own to run the project and to assume the liability. So this is really heavily negotiated because governments, they don't like to change horses in the middle of a long-term project. Banks, they cannot risk their money if the projects start having problems. So this is why the developer in this negotiation really is sidelined. It's negotiations between the banks and the government. Confidentiality and transparency, this is, as said, more resisted by the government because the public sometimes, these projects face public opposition sometimes. Sometimes the public demand information the government is not willing to advertise. They demand costing information. They demand tendering, why this project was tendered to such and such. So confidentiality is something the government more likely to try to limit in these contracts than the private developer. Dispute resolution, as I said, almost all of these contracts in one way or another go through a dispute of some sort, whether you're disputing the fees, whether the project is delayed because of permits, whether the traffic forecast or revenue forecast falls shorter than. So these all lead to conflicts. Conflicts in these public-private partnerships are like arranged divorces because these contracts, they last for 20, 30 years. Nobody can predict the future with certainty to limit the potential changes that could take place throughout the contract lifetime. So this is why you have a built-in mechanism for dispute resolution to make sure whichever arises can have the right mechanism to be resolved. The solution is, of course, is not provided in the contract, but the mechanism, how to resolve these conflicts, is provided in the contract. How I'm doing with time?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, another 1 minute. Engineer Loyal, you're doing perfect with the time. You're
fine. This is my picture like 10 years ago. So, okay, this is... I like to focus on this slide, really. Step and rise is very important to public-private partnerships because, as I said, 80 to 90% of the money is provided by the banks. So it concerns everybody, the step and rise. It concerns the bank, the developer. The developer, if he gets kicked out, he will lose all his money, all his contributions, the 10, 20% he paid, It's gone. So this is why this is like a tri-party negotiations, the developers, the banks, and the government. The government, they don't like it. The developer, they don't like it. The banks insist on it. So this is something to watch for. As I said, material adverse government change and change in law, they're similar. The difference is the extent of each. Force majeure is something that you have to limit. You don't go to these contracts with open-ended items, what constitute a force majeure, because when a force majeure happens, everybody gets money. The government loses, the developer, or the other way around. So this is a win-lose situation. So try to limit the events that can cause a force majeure.